You've heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Happy Labor Day to everybody out there. We want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Other Side. And sitting right across the computer screen from me, I'm Mr. Margison, and he is Justin Spears. Justin, how you doing on this Labor Day?
Oh, man, I am labored out. I am glad that we have this day today to recover from a very busy weekend. Had a lot going on, had some family in town, but really excited to be able to get some time today to go through and do this and get ready for the rest of a busy week. I know we have been working hard, here for the first couple weeks of school. You and I both having some coaching duties going on and everything. So it's always just super nice to be able to get an opportunity to just decompress and relax a little bit. And so, as always, we thank everybody for tuning into the show. We are really making some strides. I've had more and more people kind of commenting on the show to me. I've had more people asking me questions as I come into contact. I had some family in town that asked me about the show and said they were going to try to sit down and give a listen to some of our archive shows. So we're trying to, again, reach our influence as much as we can, both locally around where we are here in Central Indiana, but across the country as well. So it's always encouraging when we hear that. And, there are many, many different ways in which we try to deliver the show. We don't have a dedicated marketing budget for the show. We certainly are kind of doing this more as a hobby right now. So we always appreciate any support that we can get. Sharing, liking, commenting, emailing, all of that stuff helps us to be able to influence our reach. And there are many different ways in which you can hear the show. We do this as a Google Hangout on Air, which streams it live through YouTube. And our YouTube channel, The Other Side, Mike Justin, you can search for that on YouTube. If you prefer to get the show on demand, there are numerous different ways in which you can get the show on demand. You can get us through iTunes, through Google Play Podcasts. There is a podcast app called Spreaker Radio app that you can get. You can search that online and search for the show The Other Side with Margison and Spears. You can subscribe there and get the show. You can listen to us in Central Indiana, West Central Indiana in particular, out of Crawfordsville, 92.1, 1550 AM, WCVL. You can hear the show there replayed on Saturday mornings. Their website is WCVLAM.com. That's Mr. Dave Peach and his gang out there. We always appreciate their support. And we are a part of an online radio broadcast team, the Cerberus Radio Network. You can hear us on their Radio Co. channel, the Cerberus Radio Network. We're replayed Monday through Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. All of our archive shows are on replay there. And you can, again, contact us through our email, Margison and Spears at gmail.com. We're on Facebook and we are on Twitter. You can search The Other Side in both platforms and you will be able to find our show. So having gotten all of that out of the way, we are in part 2 of an 8-part series on the presidents. Last week, we covered our first president, George Washington, and talked a little bit about what he faced and some of the things that you may not have been aware of having gone through formal education. Today, we're going to talk about a lesser known president, our 8th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren. And so there was a lot going on at this period of time. He's coming off of the Jacksonian presidency and 8 years under President Jackson. And so there's a lot going on. And we're going to kind of start off with having Mike take us through a little bit about what President Van Buren was facing at home, specifically from an economic perspective. So Mike, talk to us a little bit about what was going on with President Van Buren as he takes office here in 1837.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I'm going to just, like you said, I'm going to quickly backtrack and recap that we did talk about George Washington last week. And the way that we've kind of organized this is we are going to do 4 relatively well-known presidents and 4 much lesser known presidents. That's kind of the way that we've organized the show, and we're going to do it sequentially. So George Washington being the first president, that's what we talked about last time. And what we basically went over there was a lot of his presidency, I don't think is critically analyzed in U.S. history textbooks, or he kind of gets a pass because he's the first president of the United States, and he was a great man and a great military commander. But items like the First National Bank, which we think are very consequential, aren't dealt with some of the same criticism, I guess, that we would like to approach it with. But the next 3 episodes are going to be presidents who you may not be all that familiar with. And the whole, all of the 19th century, really what you have is you have a series of presidents who I think have been kind of unfairly thrown into the dustbin of history. And they're generally referred to as rather inconsequential, kind of do-nothing presidents. And in fact, there's one modern historian who described Martin Van Buren that way, described him as lacking, quote, executive energy, whatever that means. Actually, while I do know what it means coming from a leftist historian, what that means is that he is a president who didn't invade anybody, didn't try to centrally plan the economy, and basically abided by what the Constitution permitted him to do. And this is a common theme throughout the 19th century presidents, not just Van Buren, but you have a number of presidents here like Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce and Zachary Taylor and James Polk, and later we're gonna talk a little bit about Andrew Johnson and then Grover Cleveland. But what you have here is you have a lot of one-term presidents, and so I think kind of the common consensus is these guys were one-termers, and they don't have their names attached to anything significant. You know, it's not like Lincoln with the Civil War or Teddy Roosevelt with the Progressive Era. They don't have their names linked to anybody, to anything significant. And we kind of then look at them and say, well, they must not have been any good. You know, so we're automatically going to move them down the list of good presidents. And modern leftist historians, of course, they hate the fact that a president would sit back kind of with their hands off and not centrally plan the economy or not drag the country into war. And they're the ones who write the textbooks, and they're also the ones who issue these, presidential rankings. So I think what you get is U.S. history students, they are given no other narrative than big government is better. So with Van Buren, kind of like you alluded to, Justin, my main focus here is going to be the Panic of 1837, because this is probably the episode that undid him and made him a one-term president. And I'm going to talk about not so much what Martin Van Buren did with respect to the Panic of 1837, but it's rather what he didn't do that we need to pay attention to. And I don't want to tread over old ground here because we talked about this a lot last week, but we have to revisit the idea of the national bank here because it's crucial to not only the recession, but the overall political climate of the time. So just a quick history of the bank. Remember, this was authorized by George Washington in 1791 on a 20-year charter, and that would go up to 1811. Well, at this time in 1811, the person in the White House was James Madison, and James Madison was vocally opposed to the First Bank of the United States. And so when it arrived to him for recharter in 1811, he did not recharter it. Inexplicably, James Madison dragged the country into a disastrous war with England the very next year, the War of 1812. And there was, a little bit of financial calamity after that. And trying to, I guess, recover a little bit of his reputation, James Madison does an about-face at the end of his presidency, and he authorizes the Second Bank of the United States, which would go for another 20 years. So this is 1816, and it would run up to 1836. Now, in 1816, when he authorized the Second Bank of the United States, the bank did exactly what opponents said it would do. It immediately started inflating the money supply. You see this increase in economic activity, but it's not real, right? It's fake because you have the overissuance of banknotes, and that's going to result in a crash. And it's the first major peacetime crash in U.S. history. It's called the Panic of 1819. It was pretty severe. And after that, you had a whole bunch of people saying, look, we told you so. If you give political power or if you kind of marry political power and a national bank, if you kind of marry the government and the bank, this is exactly what you're going to get. And so as we draw to the end of the bank's charter here in 1836, the person in the White House now is Andrew Jackson, and his vice president is Martin Van Buren. And they have said absolutely not. We are not going to recharter this bank. Jackson and Van Buren were staunch advocates of sound money, or really just smart money policies. Jackson and Van Buren, they hated debt. And this is amazing. Justin, think about this. Together, under that administration, they paid off the last U.S. Treasury bond in 1835. In 1835, America was officially debt-free. It was running surpluses, not like surpluses like we ran here in 2000, where you had a one-year surplus. The nation was actually debt-free. I mean, that's just unimaginable today. These policies, unfortunately, have been abandoned, and we've talked about that a lot. And here we sit nearly 21 trillion in debt, which this is just an unsolvable problem. But guys like Jackson and Van Buren, they approached monetary policy a little bit different. And so they refused to recharter the Second Bank of the United States. Not only that, they required payments for federal land to be made with actual money, not monopoly money, not just, willy-nilly banknotes that could be issued and sent around. And so going up until 36, which would have been the end of the charter for the Second Bank of the United States, unsurprisingly, the Second Bank of the United States inflates the money supply in the 1830s, at least until 1836, when the bank was not rechartered. This fueled Western land speculation, surprise. And what you have here is you have land being sold for far more than it's valuable. And this bubble, along with a few other factors like the price of cotton, and there were some problems with inflows from Great Britain. But anyway, this caused a big bust in the American economy. And as I was, putting these notes together, I really felt like I could have been talking about the 2008 housing bubble. I mean, if you think about it, you have Federal Reserve policies, which caused an increase in the money supply. And then you have all of this unnecessary speculation in one particular industry, and then it busts. That's exactly what happens in 1837. But what's taught in the standard classroom here, though, is Andrew Jackson crushed the bank. He moved federal deposits to state banks, and then those state banks overextended their loans, fueling the crash. And had the Bank of the United States still been standing, it would have had regulatory powers to stop the state banks from acting crazy, and they would have prevented this entire thing. But really, all this argument is doing is admitting the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which we've talked about on this program before, which says that any bank, not just a central bank, but even a state chartered bank, which overextends money, this will fuel an unnatural boom, and that will be followed by an inevitable bust. But it's also saying, like, let's just have one big bank do all the bad things that all the little small state banks were doing. And that argument doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. So anyway, you have this, inflationary boom up until 1836. You have, speculative land prices, which bust. The economy goes into recession. Banks stopped issuing specie for the notes they were getting, which means they stopped issuing actual gold and silver. People are rushing to get their deposits out. Banks start closing, and we go into a typical 19th century depression. The crucial lesson here is how Martin Van Buren responded. And here are some of his words. The president said we should refrain, quote, from suggesting to Congress any specific plan for regulating the exchanges of the country, relieving mercantile embarrassments, or interfering with the ordinary operation of foreign or domestic commerce. Because, quote, their adoption would not promote the real and permanent welfare of those they may be designed to aid. What he's saying here is the absolute last thing that we can do, and this is what people were calling for, was recharter the Second Bank of the United States, because he's saying that's not actually going to help the people who are being hurt. It's simply going to help connected politicians and some of these wealthy industrialists, all the stuff that we talked about last week. So he said, first of all, let's hit the brakes on that. That's not happening. And he goes on to basically say, look, hey, rather than say the federal government is going to be here to give you all of these goodies and freebies when times are tough, Van Buren says, no, what we're going to do is we are going to cut federal spending and therefore cut taxes. This was his response to a severe economic contraction. It was to drastically cut federal spending. And if you just look at federal spending numbers, like when he took office, they were at 40 million. The next year, 1838, they went down to 38. The next year, they went down to 32 million. And the year after that, under $30 million. I mean, this is a substantial cut in federal spending. And if you compare this to what we did in 2009 after the major crash in 2008, no, it wasn't to cut federal spending. It was to pile on more fake money and to pile on more debt and to burden future earners and future taxpayers with this almost unreasonable debt that we're simply not going to be able to pay off. Van Buren did the opposite. And what this did was it offered much needed tax relief to the public. And that's money that it could be used for consumption. It could be used for investment. And what you see is that by 1838, the economy was back in recovery. And this is really common throughout the 19th century. The economy will go through these, periods of speculation and then bust and speculation and then bust. But in all of these cases, whether it's the Panic of 1837 or 1857 or 1893 or whatever, what the governments did was they cut their spending, not increased it. They cut their spending and therefore were able to cut taxes and offer tax relief to the public. And that got the economy flowing again. Compare that to what we do now, which is to pile on enormous amounts of debt. This is why the economy never actually recovered after 2008. It had 8 years to do so, and it didn't. What we did was we piled on regulations, we piled on more debt, and that just acts as a shackle on the economy. So Van Buren, he really respected his constitutional duties, what he was allowed to do. And this is where I want to start to kick it off over to you, Justin. Van Buren was a constitutionalist, and today's presidents, they just simply are not. In fact, one of the things that I like to do actually is I pull up inaugural addresses. There's actually one website where you can go through all of them. And if you just do a Control F and search for the word Constitution, like Van Buren in his only inaugural address, he makes reference to the Constitution or fidelity to the Constitution 5 different times in that address. Grover Cleveland, who we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, 8 different times, 8 different references to the Constitution or fidelity to Constitution. Barack Obama in 2008, 0 references. Donald Trump, 0 references. This is just kind of slipped away. So Justin, talk to us. Like, what is the difference between presidents then and presidents now?
Yeah, this is a very, very important thing to note. And I know when you read through a history or government textbook, this is entrenched into the way that our history is presented. And that is this overall sense of what government is and what it is intended to do. We have, as you said before, in many, many different episodes, you can go back through our archives, talked about the role and purpose of what government is there for and what the Constitution is about. It is a charter of powers. It's a contract, a compact between the people of what government should do and can do versus what rights are retained to the people and what rights are protected through the Constitution against our government infringing upon them. Because after all, that is what, spurred the foundation of this country, was an abusive government that was overstepping its boundaries, that was squashing natural rights. And so I think that's a very important background and context to understanding these presidents. I think oftentimes history has the ability through hindsight, 2020 vision, to look back and critique and look back and be critical of these presidents, as you were pointing out there earlier. But in some ways, it's really unfair to do that, because you're taking a 2018 lens and applying it to the early to mid 1800s. And you can't do that. You lose the perspective and the context of what was going on. And so, part of that is, how these presidents and politicians viewed their power being in office. And obviously, in particular, here we're talking about the presidents. And so, with that kind of in mind, I went back and did exactly what you were mentioning there. I went and read through Van Buren's inaugural address, and I just kind of wrote down some themes, some ideas of what he expresses in here. And I kind of wanted to go through the summary of this and then kind of end up with what you were referencing. And one of the first things that I kind of wrote down and picked almost immediately out, which again, I don't think you see, and I like that you talked about Obama and Trump, because both of those guys, massive egos, maybe expressed, maybe expressed in different ways, but clearly massive egos, intentionally, probably through their policies, gaining the people to see them as the arbiter of solving all of the problems of the country. And so, Van Buren is very humble. He starts off with just kind of acknowledging those that have come before him. He was born at the end of the Revolution, as the country is being founded. I think he was born in 1782, if my memory serves me right, on his birth date. So he's coming in, 5 years old when the Constitution is written, and he's showing reverence. And many times in his inaugural address, he refers to the founding fathers and the deep sense of gratitude that he has towards what those people sacrificed to get this thing up and running. So very humble, showing a lot of gratitude at being president. And that kind of struck me in his first opening statements here in his address. He then moves on to an acknowledgement of the citizens of this country and their role in making this thing work. Now, he is an executive in a period of time of a lot of rapid change. Normally we don't think of, change the way that we do today as applying back in the 1830s. We think about the way technology changes our lives today. But you have to remember, there is unprecedented growth and very rapid change. And if anything, they're kind of shackled and handcuffed by a lack of technology, right? So, for example, wrap your mind about around something that you may have been taught about, with the Indian removal, and just kind of understanding as we expand the country westward, coming into contact with Native American tribes and the policies and things of that nature, the annexation of Texas, what challenges that brought about for our government. One of the things that Van Buren says in his address is, look, this experiment, very important, he calls it that, this experiment in our government was not designed to be able to govern a territory as wide as what we're amassing, yet this is happening. It's kind of like there was almost this irresistible force of westward expansion. And, he doesn't get too deep into how to manage that, but he does address it. And he does talk about how this is something that we have to deal with. We have to wrestle with this. And how do we do that? How do we ensure that we keep this fragile experiment together while growing? And he talks about the size of the government at this point is double, or not the government, the country is double what it was at its onset. And that presents a lot of challenges. And his reaction, as we've pointed out here, is to leave it to the local, state authorities and governments to manage the people and what's best for them, not to look for the one size fits all that we see so readily available today, where when there's an issue in this country, we immediately turn to Washington, D.C. to look for solutions to these problems. So I thought that was an interesting thing. And embedded in that is the sense of duty and responsibility that you and I as citizens of the country have in making that happen. I kind of wrote down here with this too. He almost kind of is a predecessor to what over 100 years later, President Kennedy famously quips, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's essentially what Van Buren is saying here is, you need to figure this out at a local level, get with the people in your state, municipality, township, county, whatever unit of government you have, and figure out what works best for you. Don't turn to us to look for solutions. And I thought that was interesting. Then he kind of has a transition period here where he goes into what I kind of wrote were tests on the union, right? There's, like you talked about, economic domestic problems with the banking and the economy. I mentioned too, you've got Native American issues where there's battles brewing here and problems of how to handle that. There are some foreign issues as well with trade and protectionism and tariffs, and how do I appease the North and also keep the South? How do I handle expansion of states, slave owning? How do I deal with the issue of slavery? You know, you could very easily become overwhelmed with everything that's going on here at this time. And so he kind of, as we've alluded to here, very calmly, really. I mean, you can almost read the calming influence of what he's saying here. And listen, I don't necessarily agree with everything, by the way, that Van Buren writes. For example, there's at one point he writes about how the people of the country have been shown to willingly take on taxation to pay for what we've had to do to ensure the preservation of the Union. And he kind of talks about some gradual expansion of some things. But by and large, though, his message is very clear here. And so he starts off by kind of making sure that everybody understands this thing isn't a guarantee, right? And I mentioned earlier that he talks about the experimental nature of this government. I think that gets lost on us sometimes. You know, we hear about, for example, and I tell this to my students in the classroom, the divine nature of the Constitution, as though, you know, Jesus Christ cracked open the clouds and dropped the Constitution down into Liberty Hall, Freedom Hall, and that, you know, that this thing was just a slam dunk, nothing wrong could ever happen. I mean, clearly that's not the case, but sometimes that kind of attitude is pervasive today, that you know, there's just this perpetual nature to this, and it's always going to occur. $21 trillion in debt, that doesn't mean anything. We're the United States of America. We've helped win 2 world wars, and this thing's always going to happen. But no, guys, it's not. It is very fragile, and at any point in time, there can be a tipping point, a flashpoint, where this could quickly fade away. So he's trying to acknowledge that by talking about the fact that this union is not a guarantee. We have to hold on to it and continue to work at it to keep it going. He then talks about, as I mentioned earlier, the growth of the union, and that has really placed a test on federalism, which again is this divided power between a national general government and the state and local governments. And again, his message is, listen, I'm going to side with the state and local governments. These people know what's best for those that are living in those territories. I have to refer to them. And I'm also refrained by what the Constitution will allow me to do. I can't just see an issue and say, I'm the president of the United States. I have unlimited power. I'm going to do whatever I want, whatever I can, you know, in my personal beliefs to solve this problem. It's completely opposite of what you see today, where when you see an issue, domestic or foreign, how many times do you see the president interject their personal beliefs, just completely disregarding the Constitution? You mentioned it, Mike, when talking about the fact that it doesn't even really get mentioned in inaugural addresses anymore, right?
No, they don't even talk about it. But like, just to carry on to one point that you said, they don't just believe that they have the power to do it. They think that they have the knowledge to do it too. I mean, think about the audacity behind that. At least Van Buren almost was saying, I don't know how to solve all these things. I'm just a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point too, where, yeah, the hubris of these people today to think that they have the solutions themselves. You're absolutely right. We see that as a modern ideology. And so, yeah, the last part here that we see that he addresses, obviously, is the issue of slavery. And his message is very simple. He says, I won't touch it. I'm not going to deal with it. It's not something that I'm given the authority to do, and so, as president. And so, therefore, it's not something that I'm going to address. And so, really, if you kind of summarize all this down, you know, basically he's elected to perform tasks granted to him by the Constitution. His role is not to interject his moral opinion on what should be done in the country. And to kind of wrap this up, in that same inaugural address that you mentioned to Congress, He kind of also talks about this too. He says all communities are apt to look to government for too much, even in our own country, where its powers and duties are so strictly limited. Notice he doesn't talk about expanded power and the authority of the federal government to do whatever it wants. He's talking about strictly limited power. We are prone to do so, especially at periods of sudden embarrassment and distress. So he's saying, look, it's easy when we see something very bad, like a panic or a depression or slavery or a trade battle or something, to turn immediately to the government and say, fix this, do this for us. He's saying we oftentimes will yield to the temptation, however, would be a mistake to do that, because all former attempts on the part of the government to assume the management of domestic or foreign exchange have proven injurious. He goes on to say, a system founded on private interests, enterprise, and competition without the aid of legislative grants or regulations by laws. That's the embodiment of that Jeffersonian maxim that the less government interferes with private pursuits, the better for the general prosperity. So he's saying, as you accurately pointed out, we have to allow things to play out. We can't just cede power because we see something bad going on and rewrite the rules of the game. This sacred, consecrated document tells us what we can do as government, and we can't just change the rules in the middle of the game because we don't like the way that something is going on. That creates a whole series of unintended consequences when the government steps in and tries to solve these issues. So, again, I encourage you to think about that. Go back and read parts of Van Buren's addresses and quotes and inaugural and compare that to what you hear and see today. And you'll see a completely different attitude and approach. And I challenge you and encourage you to think about what things might look like if we were more along the lines of the Van Buren ideas and philosophy of limiting government and from injecting into all of our ills in society today, and think about what things might look like. So that's kind of, I think, taking those two issues together, his views on government, and then seeing it practically applied through how he handled the Panic of 1837, helps give you a little bit of a sense of where presidents like this were during this period of time.
A view on government that is sorely missed today. Very, very good history, Mr. Spears. We've talked about this before, but I always find it funny just in today's times, how people, kind of like you were talking about, how people immediately look to Congress, look to the government to solve problems, yet they offer them what, like a 7% approval rating? What is Congress's approval rating now? I mean, it's literally like 7 or 8%. Yet when something goes wrong, like the most serious thing happens, where do people turn their heads? To this incompetent body that they themselves have acknowledged can't do anything right, but they turn to them to fix it. That itself is befuddling. Well, anyway, great history, Mr. Spears, and that's going to cut it for us today. Next week, somewhat of a controversial figure, Andrew Johnson, the gentleman who succeeded President Abraham Lincoln. We're going to be talking about him, and he is another one who is generally trashed by historians. I have seen several presidential rankings where he comes in dead last, and we'll talk about that. Is that a fair placement of Johnson in history? So be sure to tune in next week. Justin, thank you for spending your Labor Day with us. And to everybody listening, we thank you for your support. We thank you for listening. And now you have heard the other side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard the other side.